Hi everyone, we are here with none other than Sam Shankland, who's Grandmaster, US champion, and latest to the list, author. Hi Sam, how are you
I'm good. How are you doing?
doing? I'm good too, thanks. Um, First question is, how did you get into writing chess books? How do you go from having this top level chess career to deciding to put that on paper?
So it started in 2017, where I had a bet with my coach Jakob Ogards. We had a bet who's going to get there first, me to 2,700 or him to under, I think it was 80 kilograms. He was trying to lose some weight at the time. And if he won the bet, I was going to have to write a book because I was not super keen on the prospect before, and he wanted me to. And I was like, yeah, I don't really feel like it. So we made that bet. I'm like, okay, fine. And so at some point, like I was still like 2670 or something, and he was like within like half a kilogram of getting there. And I was like, okay, I'm clearly busted here, so I just have to start writing. The funny
Right.
thing is, he never actually made it, but I did. I did just write the book anyway. So I wrote Small Steps to Giant Improvement in like October of 2017, and maybe into November. And so then it came out in March the next year. And then in April, I won the U.S. Championship, shot to 2,700. Then I won the Capablanca Memorial right after American Continental. So I won three tournaments in a row. If you had just taken those 3 months for chess players and just taken performance ratings from those 3 months, I would have been world number one, which was quite good. Obviously, you have more than just 3 months in terms of the rating system, but and
Yeah.
across that whole year, my world ranking would have been world number nine. So basically right after Small Steps came out, I just started killing everybody. And furthermore, like the game that won me the US championship could have just fit perfectly into Small Steps one, like in chapter
Uh,
seven. So I basically I realized that the process of writing this book really helped my chess improve a lot. Because there would be some themes that I would maybe understand to some degree intuitively, but couldn't really put on paper very well or explain that well. And when I forced myself to really dig deep and explain them in layman's terms, I found I understood them better and I learned a bit. And so ever since then, I've focused quite a bit on producing content, and it is all done with the same goal in mind: make me a better chess player. I mean, it
okay.
might sound selfish, but like, I don't write books because I care about the readers or trying to like do anything like that. It's literally just it's part of my training. And if
Yeah.
people can come along with me for part of that journey and enjoy it, then that's great.
No,
But
well,
it's all
that's
for
the
self.
best marketing for your books. I mean, you went to wrote it and then did so well. Like, there's no
Yeah,
other proof. Proof is in the pudding of why this book is so great. And that's
sure.
good that you're so intentional with writing in all the books. So, to help your chess and maybe unrelated or not linearly, but helping your readers as well. And why pawn? Your first two books all about pawns. Third one, Rook Endgame. But how did you decide on that topic? That was going to be your first
Well, the third
topic.
one was the third one was the calculation workbook, and then the fourth one was Rook Games. But yeah, so
Yeah.
I just thought that I was looking for topics in chess literature that hadn't been addressed yet, and the specific concept of not pushing your pawns too far forward or taking advantage of them, I just didn't think had been properly addressed really anywhere. And there were things that I thought were not covered, like the idea of, like for example, just specific cases. If you push your pawn too far forward, you can loosen control of key squares. Here's examples of how this could happen and how to avoid it, and then to flip the exact same thing and go back over all of the same topics again, but this time, how can we provoke our opponents into making these undesirable pawn advances that we could take advantage of? That was something I hadn't really seen discussed. And then the book on Small Steps 2 on passed pawns, I thought people really didn't understand passed pawns that well. Like, I
Mm.
mean, I know there's, for example, Kramnik is famous for promoting his D pawns, but like, no one really understood how. And one of the things that I figured out from that book, which I think was not super obvious right away, is if you have a far advanced pass pawn in the middle game, the best strategy is almost always to attack the enemy king, which sort of sounds like almost a complete non sequitur. Why? What relation do these
Yeah,
two things
sounds
have?
unrelated.
But the premise is basically when there's a whole bunch of pieces on the board, it's very unlikely that your passed pawn is just going to be able to just go c4, c5, c6, c7, c8, queen. That's just not really a thing. But what this can do is drag your opponent's pieces over to more defensive positions against that pawn. And then this frees you to make unrelated threats on the other side of the board, and their pieces will be unable to defend. So my favorite example, there's a couple examples in the book. One of my game with
show it quickly. Let me show
yeah, sure. If we go to page
single and
7.
happy.
I had some fun with the chapter names.
So single and happy, is this about isolated pawns, I'm assuming? Or
Yeah,
isolated
pawns in the middle game. Isolated pawns in the game. So this is the one here, Peter Lecco against Mixing Bishop of. So what we see is we join the game here at a moment after black has already sacrificed a rook for a far advanced passed pawn. And while we have this monster pawn on b2, it's very clear that with the current piece assortment, with black having like a dark square bishop and fewer total pieces on the board, you are not going to win the fight for the b1 square. So this pawn seems like it's just firmly stopped. And so what we see here is the best thing for black to do is to make unrelated threats against white's king. And it might look like, yeah, after rook e1, queen h2, king f1, it's like, you're not going to make this king. You don't have enough pieces. But the premise is that after a couple of repeated moves and then time control was reached, that here, black found this move bishop f6. And the point is quite simple. Black wants to play bishop h4 and queen f2 mate. And he's pointing out that white cannot effectively stop this plan because he's stuck babysitting the b2 pawn. So for example, if white were to play queen e2, okay, here there would be queen h1, bishop h4, which would win anyway. But like, say he were to go something like rook b1 and then whatever, bishop h4, queen d4. Yeah, he stopped the mate, but now he's going to get skewered. And as a result, like he wasn't able to properly coordinate his pieces to both stop the b2 pawn and stop the e1 rook. So basically this premise that you should be attacking the king. There are plenty of other cases as well, like this one here, this game with between Ding and Duda, which I thought was one of Ding's best games ever. I know the computer wasn't like 100% convinced by parts of it. Yeah, so basically here, white's got this passed pawn on e6, which is a dangerous passed pawn in the middle game. And once again, the best strategy was to push it through, was to attack black's king. So there came knight b5, and white sacrificed a piece. And after d takes c4, here, the one flaw here, I believe, was that black could have played bishop takes e6 and he would have been okay. But after c takes d6, which feels like the more human move to try to remain at the piece, the way that Ding finished this off was fantastic. He goes e7, rook e8, and then here, he's not trying to, he is basically combining threats to mate black's king with fighting for the e8 square. So he played knight g5 here. So this threatens mate against the h7 pawn. In the event of h6, rook takes d6 should win. So queen g6. Yeah, here h6, I think it was. No, here h6, I have to be careful. h6, I think rook d6, f4 turns the tables, but we start with queen h5, right? Wherever this now. Because here we get the queen to a free square with a gain of tempo. If rook e7, there is queen e8 with mate. And after bishop d7, now and only now we play rook takes d6. And once more, while black has had no particular problem controlling the e8 square, he's got like a million pieces on it. Because his pieces are so stuck, he's just getting mated. So that was an example. And then, and yeah, so after rook takes d6 in the game position here, because Duda played queen g6, which was a more resilient defense. Queen h4 came, queen b1, and rook e1. And here again, the machine found queen takes f4, which is even stronger, but it's actually quite nice. It's the same theme. Following queen takes f4, there is bishop d7. And now again, it looks like black has the e8 square firmly under control. And to be fair, he does. But now again, attack the king, rook f6, and black is mated by rook f8.
Oh.
And here as well, there was bishop f5 is played in the game after rook e1, bishop f5, and here rook d8. And on bishop g6, this was like the sort of perfect final picture was, after bishop g6, there came rook takes b8, rook takes b8. And the best way to get this pawn through was to go queen takes f4, which threatens the rook on b8 as well as queen f8 mate, which forces black to play rook g8, right? If black had played rook e8 instead of rook g8, again, the pawn is forever stopped, but he gets mated. So he plays rook g8 instead to avoid mate, but in doing so, he's frozen his king. He's basically allowed a smothered mate. And as a result, after knight f7 check, he's forced to take the knight to avoid mate, and then next thing you know, the pawn promotes. So basically, this idea that when you have a far advanced passed pawn in the middle game, even when like it looks like all the squares in front of it are like super well controlled, usually the best strategy to push the pawn through is to just go play for mate. And that
Yeah.
was something that I hadn't fully appreciated before, and something that I was quite happy to learn from. And there were plenty of examples of this as well. There was one from my own game too. But yeah, so that was one thing that I learned in this book that I didn't learn before. There was another, which was that if you have a protected pass pawn, so this chapter, Single and Happy, is about lone isolated pass pawns. But the chapter on protected pass pawns in the middle game, what I concluded was your goal should be to trade minor pieces and keep the heavy pieces on the board. And specifically, when you're trading minor pieces, you want to trade congruent minor pieces. You don't want opposite bishops. You don't want bishop first knight. You don't want knight first bishop. You want congruent minor pieces and heavy pieces. That's what you're looking for. And this is not something I had figured out before, and it was good chess understanding. That was a long explanation. I'm sorry. You can go ahead.
No, no, that was a great explanation. I mean, I've just learned. I feel like we're having a coaching session over here, because
Yeah.
I've read a lot of structures. I mean, I work with books all the time, and not once did I think about, when you say pass pawn, the thing you think about and talk about is promoting and how am I going to get to promoting. But you just introduced a whole new idea of how to utilize pass pawn in different ways.
Yeah, pass pawns in the middle game are very different than pass pawns in the end game. That's why for small
Mm.
steps too, I broke it into two separate sections: middle game pass pawns and end game pass pawns.
Yeah. And who do you think these, or who would you say these books are aimed to? Your
So it was
small
funny when
step.
I wrote small steps. When I wrote small steps one, my target audience was like from 1,200 up to like 2,000 or so. And then I was very pleasantly surprised when multiple strong grandmasters came to me and said they really liked it. Maybe I was too optimistic with the strength of lower rated players, but it was not catered towards grandmasters by any stretch. But several of them said it was really good.
Yeah.
So basically, they should be available for everyone. For example, in theoretical rook endgames, it certainly gets more difficult as the book goes on. The first
Mm.
chapter should be very accessible to anyone who's even extremely early in their chess journey, but by the time you get to some of the complex cases in the 4-on-3 with same side and stuff like that with the various pawn structures, it's going to be much more relevant for stronger players.
Yeah. So you can grow with the book, basically. Improve as you go along. You start off as you improve, you go through the chapters, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I didn't do it intentionally. Do it in order of difficulty. Chapters 1 and 2, I think, are very basic, but
Yeah.
I tried to do it in order of how these endgames come. So, for example, some of the hardest chapters, I think chapter 4, Vancouver Transitions, is very difficult. That's probably one of the hardest chapters there is. I think that chapter 12 and chapter 11 are both harder than, for example, chapter 13 and 14. I did not organize this book in order of difficulty. I tried to just do it in order of how these endgames come. So you start with one pawn,
Mm.
then we're doing two pawns, doubled pawns, connected pawns, split pawns. Then you have 2 against 1, 3 against 2, 4 against 3, 2 against 1, and then with one pawn on the outside, things like this. So I just did it in order of how the rook endgames happen, not in order of how hard they are. But
No, that's
chapters 1 and 2
logical.
will be easy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And with, there are a lot of chess books, chess endgame books out there in the market. What would you say, how does your book fill in the gaps of endgame literature?
So if I were to go to the introduction here, I think I explained that pretty well, actually. So what I wrote
Yeah.
was countless books on rook endgames have been written. There is a valid question. Do we need another one? What more can I contribute to the current state of endgame theory? I'm just sort of reading this, but I've studied all these books. Some that made this impression are Dvoretsky's Endgame Manual. It's a fantastic book. Fundamental Chess Endings. That's probably my favorite one. Nunn's Chess Endings, Volumes 1 and 2. 100 Endgames You Must Know. I've studied these books, and they're good books. But what I had said was I found flaws. Some of them seemed like too ambitious, that they were covering too wide a range of different kinds of endgames to confine to whatever 300, 400 pages.
Yeah.
Some seemed like disorganized, that didn't have clear overarching principles. There were some that felt like a bit dry and were only looking on the sort of sciencey aspect of these endgames without any feel for how they might play out for a practical player or the practicality of what you have to memorize, things like this, and what I'd said. So when it comes to this book on rook endgames, I did ask myself that. Yes, I believe I can do better, and this is what I came up with, and this was my
Hmm.
attempt to prove it. So basically here what I did was I contributed, I think, a decent amount to the current state of theory. So if I were to estimate my guesses in this book, 80% of the stuff in this book was already known, and 20% is fresh and stuff that hasn't been seen before.
Mm.
But I also believe that the stuff that is already known, I wanted to present in a clearer, more concise, and better organized manner that has been done before, that has good mnemonics and practicality for a tournament player who needs to remember this stuff, as opposed to
Yeah.
just like it's hard to memorize stuff without reasons behind it. And I think that's the place where some of these books struggled. And then also, I tried to make at the very end a clear index of positions. These are the positions you explicitly want to have memorized, and the other ones, just a basic understanding, will be enough. So, for example, in Queen against Rook, like in the last chapter, I just said there's four Zoot Swongs you have to memorize. Pawnless Rook on games 379, right?
Yeah. In the bare bones.
No, that's the index of all the positions. So the bare bones
Ah,
of page
okay.
chapter 20 is basically I go through every single position that I think you should memorize from chapters 1 through 19. I give it like two sentences.
Oh,
So
wow. That's really
right.
great,
So
especially for
the premise
learning.
is basically like if you so this one, if you see loose end in position, this when it says pages 13 to 17, I dedicated 4 pages to this position in chapter 1. Here I dedicated one sentence. But basically the premise is that once you have gone through these 19 chapters of like the dense work, um, you're gonna forget a lot of it because you're a human being, and that's what humans do. Like we're a flawed species. We're not perfect. We forget stuff that we've been presented with, and so it's important to review these things. And while it would be silly to just look at chapter 20 and discard chapters 1 through 19 in the first place, once you have done chapters 1 through 19, it might be pretty impractical to do that chapters 1 through 19 again every 6, 9 months, whatever have you.
Yeah.
So if there was just an index of positions that you could look back to that you've already covered and be like, okay, these six I remember. Well, this one I'm a little foggy now. Let me go back to this spot. This is really helpful.
Yeah.
But like,
It's a good way to test yourself as well after
yeah.
everything, putting this in, seeing if you understood.
So, for example, if we
Yeah.
go further down in this index here, if we're talking about Queen against Rook here, basically, I think that if you memorize that this position here is Zoot Swung, you memorize that here Queen F4 is Zoot Swung, you memorize that here this position is Zoot Swung with Black to move, and with White to move, you go Queen C4, C5, D5, and then that this position is Zoot Swung, and if White can also play Queen D4. I think if you just remember that all four of those positions are Zoot Swongs, even if you don't remember how to actually win from those positions, or if you don't know any other positions, just knowing that these are the four Zoot Swongs to aim for, I think you're just going to win Queen against Rook.
Yeah.
So I've done my best to give people the minimum amount of knowledge that they need to effectively win these positions without burdening their memory, but I certainly don't want to cut it to less than what I think is sufficient to win the game.
Yeah. Wow. This is really useful to have. And your explanations, I feel like it's coming from you as, a chess player, it's very practical and logical. And instead of you have some authors and coaches who go into the nitty-gritty of words and explaining things, where I think you have a very practical approach. Like, this is what I think as a player, and this is
Yeah.
how I remember it.
I mean, there are not many authors. I don't know if you know there are any authors in chess who were publishing books actively when they were like number 20 in the world. I mean, that's not
No. Yeah.
so. Most people are either a top chess player or like a prolific chess author. As far as I know, I'm the only one who's ever done both at the same time. There's some people who were top chess players, and then later, after their playing days, were became great chess authors too. But
Mm.
for people doing it at the same time, I think I'm the only one, which
Yeah.
makes me hopefully somewhat unique.
Yeah, I know it does. It makes your books unique as well. From all
Yeah.
the end game, that's enough to say, you can be a coach and everything, but to actually test these out in practice, which you do all the time.
Yeah,
Uh,
and this book took me 3 years to write. I started it
three
in early.
years?
Well, yeah, I mean, I knew it was going to be an incredibly demanding book. All the other stuff that I did took like 1, 2 months maximum.
Hmm.
Um, but this one, when COVID first hit in early 2020, and I knew I was going to be locked down for the foreseeable future. I didn't know how long. I mean, nobody did. And then I knew I'd have no tournaments. I need something to keep me busy and something to learn. I just spoke with Jakob, and I was like, "What's the most ridiculous, demanding book topic we could possibly come up with.
Mm.
And it was like, all right, we're doing theoretical rook endgames. And so I got about 70% of the way through it in the year and a half before the COVID lockdown ended, or at least partially ended. And then once tournaments started coming back, I crushed the Prague Masters in my first tournament back at like a 2,900 performance. And then I almost won the World Cup. I lost an absolutely heartbreaking tiebreak in the quarterfinal to Karyakin. And so right away, then I was starting to get some really nice invitations, and my ability to write the book sort of slowed down. But then when I dropped a bit, the invitation stopped and the tournament schedule stopped a bit and slowed down. I was able to finish it. But I noticed that in the year and a half I spent writing this book, originally in the lockdown, like the next year where I was just sort of playing constantly, like tons of these positions were just coming up in my own books. Like if I were to talk about Vancouver Transitions, for example. So I came up with what I call the Vancouver transition line, which is basically, so in this position here, if black gets the rook to c6, this is just the Vancouver defense. But the Vancouver defense is very specific in that it works only against an h-pawn, and the premise is we're going to take this rook on h3 and place it on c6.
Yeah.
And so what's going to happen then is the h-pawn is harassed laterally from the side, and the only way white could win the game would be to get the rook out of the way from in front of the h-pawn. In order for that to happen, white is going to have to defend the h-pawn with his king.
Yeah.
So let's say the king will come to g5. This is what I talked about in the previous chapter about Vancouver positions proper. So if the king reaches, if we have the rook on c6 and white's king goes to g5, the problem white is going to face is that black's just going to start checking up and down the board like so. And because white has an h-pawn, the king cannot hide off the right side of the board onto the I-file. So, for example, if the pawn were on g6 and the rook were on g8, this would not work at all. I had a game with Hikaru like this. I mean, he tried, but, you know, the king will hide on h6 and the pawn will promote. So here what we see is that black's rook is on h3 instead, which is a more natural place for black's rook to be. Like if there were a bunch of other pieces on the board at some point, you would expect that the rook would have gone behind the passed pawn. Here, the rook on h3 will not save the game because white will connect the king with the pawn, move the rook out of the way, and then pawn goes through. And the problem is that when white gets the king to g6 and black checks from g3, white's king will go to h7, right?
Yeah.
And then the king will be safe. So that's an issue. What we will also see is that black's king is stuck for exactly the reason you cited, which is that if this king wanders too far towards the pawn, white's going to play h7. So if the king ever touches the d7, the d file after king d7, h7 will come, and white is going to come around and give a skewer. So essentially here what we see is that black's king is stuck. So what black needs to do is he needs, when I would explain this in the video, I'll just take white's king off the board. But what black needs to do is he'll bring the rook somewhere, let's say to f3 in this case. And right now, if I get to play rook to f6 next, I get the Vancouver defense, and I save the game, right? But this means for one move and for one move only, white's rook is free, right? So say white goes rook g8. I don't know if I had this as the main move in the book or not. Now h7 is a huge threat, so the rook comes back to h3, right? And so then let's say white goes rook g7 check or rook g6, something like this, king to b6 and h7. What we see now is that, remember, when white's rook was on h8, his rook was stuck, right?
Yeah. No, it's free.
But black's king was also stuck over here, right? So now what's happened is white's rook has become free, and black's king has also become free. What will happen now is this becomes a race. Whose king will get there first? So if we go back to the original position here, so if I were to take white's king off the board, this position here. So I'm going to grab this king and I'm going to take it off the board, right? So we know that what's going to happen is black's rook is going to move somewhere. Then white's rook is going to move away. Black will play rook back to h3, and then white will transfer his rook from in front of the pawn to the side of the pawn. At that moment, black's king is free, and black's king will run back to try to stop it. If white's king is on a1, it should not be hard to guess that black is going to win this race, right? Yeah. If white's king is on f5, it should not be hard to guess that white's going to win this race, right? But the question is, what if the king's on like e4? Or what if the king's on f3? And the question is, like, where does white's king have to be in order for the race to be won? And so what I came up with was there is this thing that I would call the Vancouver transition line, which would be that if white's king can make it to any of h3, g3, f3, e4, d5, e6, d7 to the right of that, this if white's king can make it to any one of these squares before black can start the Vancouver transition and transfer the rook away from the H file, then white wins the game. Right. So this is complex and deep knowledge. You'll see plenty of examples of strong players misplaying it. It decided the world championship match. Here this, for example, is Zhu Wenjun against Goryachina. So it's white to play. And we know that I have just mentioned the winning line runs from H3 to F3, F3 to D5, D5 to E6, to D7 to D8, and everything to the right. And that's assuming black's king is on the ideal B7 square. Here, if white were to play H6 in this game between Zhu Wenjun and Goryachina, white's king is already in the winning zone because we have H3 to F3, F3 to D5, D5 to E6, D7, D8. White's king is already within the winning zone. And furthermore, black's king is on C5 and needs to immediately run to B7. So white actually wins by 2 tempi to spare, not even remotely close, right? And yeah, so here H6 just wins the game immediately. Zhu Wenjun played king G4, but then after king D6, black's king was able to come back and save it. While after H6, king D6 would fall to H7. So after H6, king C6, here, I actually gave the main line of my analysis is king F2, which is obviously a ludicrous move. White will play king G4. But the point is that after king F2, king B7, white even had 2 tempi to spare because black had to bring the king all the way back to B7. So this was a classical game. Now, I have to imagine Zhu Wenjun was short of time because even if she knew absolutely nothing about this, I must believe that if she had time, she would have figured it out because it's such a blatantly obvious, that this race is so heavily in white's favor. But if you just knew what the transition area was, you just play it like that without even thinking, right?
Yeah.
So there's a question, how practical is this stuff? And what I found was that within a year, and so here's another big example. This one was between Gelfand and Anand. And this is probably too complex for a short interview, but Gelfand played rook h7 in this position here. Gelfand played rook h7, which changed the course of chess history. If he had played king g3, when his king is in the winning zone with a full tempo to spare because black's king is not on b7, he would have won this game and the tiebreak would have continued. I mean, more likely than not, I think he still would have lost the match, but his odds of winning the match, I think, given that he drew this game, were something like 5% because he would need to win with black on command and then win a blitz playoff when Vishy was quite a stronger blitz player. While if he had won this game, I think his chances of winning the match would have gone from 5% to 35 or 40, which is a pretty substantial rise. So Gelfand played rook h7, and for reasons I won't get into here, I think this is a mistake that only a very, very strong grandmaster could make, because I don't think rook h7 would even enter the mind as a candidate move for someone who hadn't studied these endgames in extreme detail, because there's a very important moment where rook h7 is an only move in one of these positions. But if I were to just digress from there and move on, what we saw was this transition line was important to understand and know. And it might look like, this is sort of fringe stuff, but literally within a year, I got this position with Alexander Predke.
And you had worked on it so thoroughly.
Yeah. So with Alexander Predke here, I got this position, and previously the last 2 moves were h4 takes g5 and f takes g5. I had tried king g4. My plan was I wanted him to take on h4. I would take back with the king, bring my king to f4, play e4, e5, and then trade the last set of kingside pawns, run my king up to b6, take a5, and win. That was basically my plan. And Predke stopped me by giving a check on g2, making sure that I couldn't liquidate the kingside, and I have to leave him with a passed pawn. So here, the best chance white has to win the game is to play rook takes a5. And my point with this move was that after rook takes a5, and he plays rook takes b3, I play rook a8. And what I get here is an idea that I want to play a5, a6, a7, basically, and then I will push my e-pawn, because my king will take care of his g-pawn, and when I push my e-pawn up, his king or his rook will have to leave, and then white wins. This probably makes sense, right?
Yeah.
So here I was just sort of hoping that Predke would instinctively play the move rook a3, which would lose the game immediately, because now what will happen is after a5, eventually if my pawn gets to a7, I just win. My e-pawn will go through. So let's say he goes g4 check, king takes g4, and rook takes e3. What we will see here is that, let's say we go takes a6, and now king g7, king f5. if we recall with the board flipped, the Vancouver transition line would be from A3 to C3, C3 to E5, E5 to D6, D6 to E7 and E8. So it might look like my king is just outside of the winning zone, right?
Yeah.
But that was assuming that black's rook is on the A file. And so what I also found was that whenever the attacking king is just outside of the winning zone or just within it, extremely accurate play is needed. And I had remembered from the Rajabov Nakamura game before that the only drawing move with black's rook on A3 here would be to play rook to A5 check. And because black's rook is on E3, he doesn't have this check available. So if he were to play something like rook B3, let's say, here the problem is I'm going to give rook A7 check, and he cannot place his king on the back rank. Because if he does, then I will move my rook away and the pawn promotes itself. I don't even need the king's help. And if he has to go to h6, his king now may as well be on another planet. And after something like this, it's not even remotely close. Like rook a3, a7. His king is completely cut off. I'll just walk the king straight to b8, and it's all too easy. Yeah. So I had seen this, and this is what I was hoping for. But unfortunately for me,
Predke... So all of this, can we just pause on that like you... So all of this...
I didn't see it. I knew it.
Okay. That is...
I mean, that helps. But so Predke here at this point, so I was sort of hoping for this to happen. Basically that he would instinctively just play rook a3 check, or rook a3 just because that's the move you make to put the rook behind the pass pawn. Yeah. Unfortunately for me though, what happened in that line is after rook a3, rook takes e3, black lost a tempo. Predke instead played g4 check, which wins the move. So in this position I got to thinking, if I play king takes g4, rook takes e3, and then a5, let's say, and he goes king g7, and I go king f5, and let's say he goes rook a3, a6. I realized here he's got the rook behind the pawn. It's time to start the transition. And at this point, white's king is just outside of the winning zone, right? Yeah. So basically, unfortunately, what all this did for me was let me know well in advance that I was not going to win the game. That was sort of unfortunate. I was hoping that my knowledge would be a bit more helpful from that. It just told me, nope, sorry, you're making a draw this time. Tough luck. But it did let me realize that king takes g4 was a draw immediately if he defended reasonably well, which I thought he would. So I played king f4 instead, which is a little trickier. And here black only has one drawing move. You want to try to find it?
One drawing move. Maybe g3, bring the king back and check again.
Is that your final answer?
What if I play rook b4? Check.
Okay, is that your final answer?
Yes, that's my final answer.
That's right. So here, the problem is if black plays g3, what I can actually do is play rook to g8 and just give up the a pawn, and now what black's king is cut off. So I just transitioned to a completely different kind of endgame. After check in here, rook takes a4, and rook takes g3. Black's king is cut off along the g file, and I'll just win by cutting him off. After rook to a8, white wins immediately by playing e5. That's just not even a discussion because the pawn reaches the 5th rank, which means it's always winning. But because black's king is specifically on the h file, even if it were black to move in this position, and he could start frontal checks already, he still loses because after king e5, rook to e8 check, I can play king f6, and he can't take the pawn, which is nice. But so that loses. So this I figured he would not fall for. But there's a very tricky point that in the event of king g7, which I thought looked like a very natural move in this position, because that's where the king ultimately wants to go, right? And you could say, for example, after king g7, now g3 could come next because they're not worried about rook g8 anymore. The problem with king g7 is that white has a pretty surprising resource that I was quite happy to have found, which is rook to e8. And we just transfer this rook to e4, and white actually just saves both his pawns and wins with 2 against 0, which is quite nice. And so if you start with rook b4 check instead, what you do is force white to play e4. And now and only now you bring the king back to g7 because I no longer have rook e8 to e4 because you forced my pawn to occupy this square. And here he will save the game. So
all of that, by the way, when I said rook b4.
Well done. So but basically here, when I got this position after g4 check on the board, and I was thinking, I realized that the Vancouver transition line told me this is going to be a draw if you take the pawn. And I realized that after king f4, rook b4 check is the only saving move, and that both g3 and king g7 are quite tempting and lose. So I thought,
Mm.
okay, let's give this a try. So I thought for a bit, and I played king f4, thinking, all right, we'll see how long. He doesn't have a ton of time. We'll see. Maybe he'll think of it, struggle a little, and so I went and so I played king f4. I wrote my move down. I looked back up. Rook b4 was already on the board, and I was like, God damn it! But yeah,
Ah,
so
so,
a bit of a bummer. But
mm,
yeah, the point remains that even in this very fringy Vancouver transition section, which was very advanced and not as super common, it came up for me within a year.
wow. We're learning a lot here. This is coaching slash interview
Yeah.
of your book. Wow. And do you
What's
think Predke knew all of this, or was he just figuring stuff out on the board?
I'm I don't know. I don't think he necessarily knew everything about the Vancouver transition. I don't know, but I'd be shocked if he did. But Rook b4, he clearly figured out very fast. I don't think it's
Hmm.
a crazy difficult move, but I could at least imagine a strong player messing it up.
Yeah.
But no, he defended very well this game to save it.
Yeah. So you ended in a draw
It did, yes.
this game. Ah, okay. Well, it's
But
good to also save you the calculation time and everything. I can imagine you would have been in some kind of time trouble at this point.
not really. I mean, we first got the Rook endgame like when we first got the Rook endgame, I was winning at first, but it was much more complex and it required. I missed one important detail, and then I kept the pawn up, but it was still drawn.
Mm.
And at time control, I got half an hour, and I thought I had a position. My king was on f1, and my pawns were on g2, h4, and e3 with my king on f1, and so I had a decision to make. I can either run my king to e1 towards his rook to try to bully it off of the b2 square and then take his a5 pawn, uh, which definitely would promote a pawn. But the problem is this involves abandoning my king side, and so
Mm.
he's going to promote too. And I started calculating. I decided this race wasn't working for me. So what I did instead was I tried to play king g1, bring the king to h2 and g3 around the g2 pawn to get to the center, and that's how we ended up getting where we were. And when I calculated from there, I had seen it. I was fairly confident that I was quite confident that A, it was probably a draw, but B, the defense was very difficult. And Predke, I think, played 100% perfect moves the whole time, which was a shame. I gave this as a training position between two grandmasters, actually. And White ended up winning the game. It went from their position was originally drawn. At some point, White became winning. Then it became drawn again. Then White became winning. So even at grandmaster level, there were lots of mistakes being made in this training position. But Predke just defended 100% perfect, which was sort of a shame.
Yeah, but Kate made for a good position to add, and that's a lot of analysis you added in the book.
Yeah, no, I
All
mean,
one game. Are all your positions this thorough?
well, some of them are more complicated than others, of course. The more basic ones I don't need to explain in as much detail.
Mm.
But yeah, I mean, I tried to explain things and I tried to give as much detail as necessary and to explain it as clearly as possible without overburdening the reader with extra details that I find unnecessary. And without naming names, there are some authors who I do think do a very poor job of that. To me, when you give too many details, it almost sounds like a writer likes the sound of their own voice too much.
Hmm.
Uh, that's just me.
Yeah, more difficult to actually understand what's going on in the position. But your approach is very practical.
Yeah, that's the
Um,
goal.
yeah. And then one last question for you. I guess with endgames and seeing this, and by the time you get to an endgame, you have time pressure. Of course, you sit in this position, you've got extra time, and everything was fine. But it's one thing studying these endgames at home, and another, of course, sitting at the board, seconds left on the clock, remembering this. What would your advice be to, in terms of memory, when you get
Well, that's what the last chapter is about. Like, the last chapter is whatever 40 pages or something of positions I want you to memorize, and the rest of the book is 360 pages of explanations. I think if you go through the book, understand it, it all makes sense, figure it all out, and then memorize the positions in the last chapter, that will go a long way. You will get endgames not only when you're in time pressure, but also when you're tired because you've played the rest of the
Mm,
game already. And so if you take, for example, this Ju and Jun Goryakchina game, like I'm sure that if Ju and June woke up one morning, had some nice breakfast, got to sit down at a board, someone gave her 20 minutes and said, solve this position, the odds of her getting it wrong are something around zero. But after a long game, when she is tired and low on time, and she has to make decisions in a minute or something, and has just been playing for 4 hours, having that extra knowledge is hugely helpful.
Yeah.
And just if she had memorized all you have to memorize is one line, the game just ends immediately. And so these tools are very important to have. And while it's very rare that you're just going to play a whole end game without ever having to use your brain, if you could, then chess would get pretty boring pretty fast. These tools will definitely help you play better, faster, make more confident decisions. And then
Mm.
when it becomes a purely technical moment, you will have to calculate less and you'll just know, and that helps a lot.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Thank you very much. You put me in the mood to go learn endgames now, so that's what I'm gonna
Okay, well,
gonna go do. And I know which book I'll be using. So
well,
thank you very much. I mean, this was so deep as well. We learned a lot. Thank you.
hopefully the readers feel the same way. And thanks for the interview. It was lovely to meet you.
It was lovely meeting you too.